I still remember the electricity in the air that morning, though I had no idea how literal it would become. I was sitting at the kitchen table, my back to the window, while Mom paced back and forth in her well-tailored black slacks. She was scanning through her email on her phone, that infamous frown of hers deepening by the second. My mother, Jeanette Polson, was known in our county as the top felony prosecutor. Her stern facade had made grown criminals wilt on the witness stand. But she was still my mom, the same person who once made me pancakes shaped like Star Trek insignias every Saturday, the same person who taught me to spot bias in news articles when I was in 5th grade. That morning, she was more exasperated than usual. I had no clue what was bothering her until she set her phone down on the table and let out a weary sigh. "Jacob," she said to me, "I think we just stepped on some rather stupid toes." For a woman who rarely wasted words, calling something rather stupid meant something big. I picked up the phone to see an email from the Oakleaf Creek Homeowners Association, HOA, subject line, "Final warning, $47 fine past due." $47. In all my 15 years, I'd never seen my mother panic or get angry over such a meager sum. Yet there it was, bold and blinking, with a threat of further action if the fee wasn't paid within 24 hours. I didn't know it yet, but that further action would go far beyond phone calls or letters. Reclining against the back of my wooden chair, I tried to lighten the mood. "Come on, Mom. You can't possibly be worried about a $47 fine." She gave me a look that said I didn't understand. Truth is, she was right, I didn't. People who knew her from the courtroom called her the Barracuda behind her back, especially defense lawyers who'd seen her tear their client's testimony to shreds. She certainly wasn't the type to be intimidated by any group, let alone a petty HOA. "There's more to it," Mom said, tidying the already immaculate stack of documents in front of her. "Remember the letter we got last week? It was about the front lawn, how we replaced the patchy sod with gravel. The HOA claims the landscaping code doesn't allow it. We submitted the new design plan a month ago. They never responded, so we assumed they were fine with it. Now, they're fining us, claiming we broke the uniformity guidelines. If we don't pay, they'll tack on late fees or put a lien on our property. This email is the second official notice we've gotten in less than a week. Why not just pay it?" I asked, feeling a little naive. She shook her head. "Because if I do, they'll keep nickel-and-diming us for every minor infraction. Trust me, I've dealt with HOAs before. Some are straightforward, but some operate like mini despots. There's a principle here. We followed the rules, and they're ignoring their own guidelines. My plan is to meet them head-on, politely at first. If they want to escalate things, well, they'll be in for a surprise." By surprise, she clearly meant her no-nonsense legal approach. The problem is, HOAs rarely see reason the way a courtroom does. They answer to the labyrinth of their own regulations. And if you try to protest, you're basically at the mercy of whichever power-hungry board members happen to run the show. As Mom started drafting a formal notice disputing the fine, I watched her with a mixture of admiration and nerves. She thrived in conflict. The sharper the allegations, the more methodical and calm she became. One might say she was addicted to confrontation that could be turned into a legal argument, a puzzle she was determined to solve. Yet somewhere deep inside, I sensed something unusual about her demeanor. Maybe I was imagining it, but she had this tension in her shoulders that I hadn't seen before. Even the coffee mug she clutched trembled slightly, as if she felt something bigger brewing. Oakleaf Creek, our quiet suburban neighborhood, had always seemed so prim and proper. Pastel houses, carefully trimmed hedges, wide sidewalks perfect for retirees walking their dogs. We'd lived there for over a decade without any real troubles. Sure, the HOA was sometimes nitpicky. I recall they once sent out an email with 37 bullet points on acceptable mailbox designs. But nothing serious. As Mom clicked send on her dispute letter, she paused and muttered under her breath. "They have no clue who they're dealing with, do they?" The words sent a chill down my spine. Mom had taken down some of the state's most ruthless criminals, but she was about to find herself in a completely different type of battlefield. I glanced out the window. The overcast sky matched my uncertainty, a sense that something was coming. I had no idea how soon and how violently it would arrive. Oakleaf Creek's next move arrived on Tuesday afternoon, in the form of a so-called inspector. I had just come home from school when I saw a man with a clipboard. Where do they always find these folks? Lurking near our driveway. He wore a polo shirt emblazoned with the HOA logo. If I recall correctly, his name was Lance. He smelled faintly of cologne mixed with mildew, like the kind you catch in a thrift shop. I found it bizarre that he didn't ring the doorbell right away. He was strolling around the side of our house, jotting down notes. He took pictures of the gravel Mom had laid down, then zoomed in on our mailbox. That mailbox wasn't even 5 months old, but I guess it was all fair game to him. I set my backpack inside, grabbed my phone, and walked out to the driveway. "Can I help you?" I called out. He gave me a perfunctory half nod, half shake of the head, as if acknowledging me, but not wanting to actually engage. "Just doing an inspection for Oakleaf Creek," he said. "I'm verifying that all changes to the exterior meet the HOA's guidelines." That's strange, because my mom said she submitted everything, and they never responded. He sighed. "Listen, kid, I'm just the inspector. I only note down the violations. I don't handle the approvals." It seemed useless to argue with him. That day, though, was a prelude. Over the next few days, we got multiple notices slipped under our door. Accusations that our gravel was a violation of uniform landscaping style. Warnings about weeds that didn't exist, claims that our porch lighting was out of compliance. Each new note carried an implied threat. Rectify these issues or face further fines. Mom's frustration grew. But for every email or letter we received, she drafted a crisp response, citing the official bylaws and referencing every date she had corresponded with them. She attached images, meticulously documenting that we'd gotten approval from the previous HOA administration for the mailbox, for example. Meanwhile, Dad was mostly out of the picture. He was traveling for work. He worked as a consultant for an engineering firm and was rarely home except on weekends. By the time he heard the story, it would already be at a full boil. Things really took a turn on Thursday. I came home to see Mom standing at the kitchen counter, biting the inside of her cheek. A piece of paper was clenched in her hand, a pale pink slip with big letters that read, "Warning, unsettled HOA fine. Final opportunity to pay." Below that, the words "possible legal action" leapt off the page, bold and underlined. "They can't do this," she said in a low, tight voice. "This is harassment. They're twisting the rules to push me into submission. Maybe we should just settle." I offered meekly. I didn't really mean it. I respected Mom's principle. But part of me worried about how far the HOA might go, and how quickly. "You don't understand. It won't stop at $47. This is how HOAs bully residents who question their authority. The minute you pay an absurd fine, they find another one. Or they try to make an example of you in front of the neighborhood." Mom was used to the justice system, where judges, evidence, and documented procedures reigned supreme. The HOA, by comparison, was the Wild West. They wrote their own rules. They could file liens with little more than a signature from the board, and they had no shortage of self-important enforcers eager to carry them out. What neither of us foresaw was the level of zeal certain board members had for keeping Oakleaf Creek pristine. Over the weekend, we found a bright orange sticker slapped on our door reading, "Noncompliance, act now." The neighbors started glancing at our house like we'd turned it into a nuclear dump site. Curiously, the confrontation was becoming personal. It wasn't just a matter of them enforcing the rule book. I overheard a rumor, spread by the next-door neighbor, that the new HOA president, a woman named Cynthia Marshall, had a vendetta against my mom. They'd apparently tangled during some local city council meeting last year, though I'd never heard about it. If that was true, it was no mere oversight or random fine. It was targeted. Mom tried calling the HOA's main office to speak with Cynthia directly. No luck. She left voicemail after voicemail, patiently explaining the situation. The only responses we got were more letters, each more intimidating than the last. By Sunday, the sense of being hunted was palpable. Our front door had become a message board for notices. The official fine had grown to $67.25, thanks to an administrative fee, and they were now threatening daily late charges if the balance went unpaid. Mom spent her Sunday afternoon drafting a motion to file in small claims court if the harassment continued. If they want to fight, she said, they've got one. I believed her. But I also knew the difference between a legal scuffle in a well-lit courtroom and a confrontation in your own front yard. HOAs often hired private security or off-duty officers for enforcement. I'd seen those rent-a-cops cruising the streets in white SUVs with community safety stickers slapped on the sides. Still, I never in my wildest dreams imagined they'd do something as outrageous and downright criminal as assaulting my mother with a taser. In our quiet suburb, the most dramatic thing I'd heard of was a break-in to steal someone's lawnmower. The idea that an HOA enforcer might physically harm us seemed absurd, until it wasn't. That next Monday, I left for school feeling uneasy. The morning sky was heavy with clouds, but I told myself it was just another day. Mom would clear everything up. She always did. Little did I know, I would never forget the events of that afternoon. That day, the tension would escalate from pink slips and orange stickers to something that changed my view of authority and shattered every illusion I had about our safe, peaceful neighborhood. It was around 3:30 p.m. when the phone call came. I was still in chess club when I felt my phone vibrate. Coach Jacobs was explaining a new in-game strategy, but I could see it was Dad calling. Normally, I'd wait, but something in me insisted I answer. "Jake, buddy," Dad said in a hoarse whisper, "you need to get home." My heart rate tripled. Dad only used that hushed, urgent tone when something serious had happened, like the time Grandpa fell and broke his hip. "What?" I asked, feeling the cold clamp of fear at the base of my spine. He paused as if steeling himself to speak. "Your mom." The HOA security guard tossed her. "The EMTs are here, the police. Just come home." I slammed my laptop shut, my pieces scattering across the chessboard. I don't even remember the ride home. Someone from the chess club drove me. Maybe. My mind was stuck on one sentence. They tossed her. When I got there, our street was flooded with flashing lights from a local police cruiser and an ambulance. Clusters of neighbors stood at their lawns, wide-eyed, whispering to each other. My hands were shaking so badly I could hardly open the car door. Outside our porch, I saw Mom being guided onto a stretcher. She looked simultaneously furious and disoriented. Her eyes found me, and she managed a small nod to indicate she was all right, or at least conscious. A paramedic pressed a gauze pad against her forearm, which was red and swollen. Another paramedic held a blood pressure cuff around her other arm. 2 uniformed police officers stood nearby, speaking with a tall, bald man in a cheap-looking private security uniform. He had one hand on his taser holster, as though the device were a prized possession. I recognized him as someone I'd seen driving the white community safety SUV around the neighborhood. I couldn't believe what was happening. Dad rushed to me as I came up the walkway. He looked pale, the veins in his neck bulging. "She's going to hospital," he said. "They need to check her heartbeat. Make sure there's no permanent damage. She got an electric jolt, for crying out loud." What happened?" I managed to ask, voice trembling. She was coming out to check the mailbox when that clown started slapping some sort of eviction notice on the door. Dad jabbed a finger toward the bald security guy. They started arguing. He told her she couldn't remove the notice, or it'd be vandalism of HOA property. She told him to get off our property unless he had a court order. Next thing we know, he's pulling a taser and shouting at her to back away or face the consequences. She tried to walk past him back into the house, and that's when he tossed her. I felt a rush of hot blood behind my eyes. Anger and fear mingled. This was beyond petty fines. This was assault with a weapon for a $47 fine that had ballooned to $67 and some change. It was insane. At that moment, Mom, half reclined on the gurney, spoke up. "Don't worry, honey," she said, her voice a little slurred but still unmistakably firm. "I'm pressing charges. They picked the wrong woman to mess with." The paramedics prepared to lift the stretcher into the ambulance. One officer turned to the bald security guard, whose name tag read McNeil. "We need to get statements," the officer said. McNeil looked rattled, but he was trying to maintain some official facade. "She was getting aggressive," McNeil muttered. "HOA guidelines said I could enforce compliance." An audible scoff came from one of the police officers. Enforce compliance? With a taser? It's a non-lethal measure. I told her to back off. She's not some burglar, man. She's a resident. And you're not the law. At that point, Mom was loaded into the ambulance. Dad climbed in with her, leaving me alone with the swirling confusion. Neighbors began approaching, hushed, worried. A few of them expressed shock, but I could also sense their hesitation. In an HOA-driven community, folks get scared about picking sides. I marched up to the police officers, determined to speak even though my chest felt tight. Officer, is he going to be arrested? He hurt my mom. He used a weapon on her. The older officer exhaled. We're taking him in for questioning at the station. Tossing someone over a property dispute, that's obviously not standard protocol. Then he hesitated, as if not sure how much to share with a teenager. But we have to follow procedure. He's a security guard, which complicates things. We'll definitely talk to the DA about assault charges. A flicker of confusion crossed his eyes when I mentioned that my mom was actually a top county prosecutor. He raised an eyebrow, then said, "Your mother is Jeanette Polson?" The Polson? I nodded, and right there, a shadow of realization moved across his face. The older officer exchanged a glance with his partner, a silent acknowledgement that this was going to be a huge deal. Tossing a random homeowner was one thing. Tossing a well-known prosecutor was quite another. In the next minute, the bald security guard, McNeil, was led away. As they guided him to a police vehicle, I caught the tail end of a radio conversation. Someone from the HOA board was calling in, insisting on clarifying the matter. Clarifying? They tossed her plain and simple. There was no clarification needed, except how the man who did it was going to be held accountable. All the while, Cynthia Marshall was nowhere to be seen. The neighbors' gossip was that she was busy in a meeting or had suddenly left town. The next-door neighbor, Mrs. Wilkins, told me that Cynthia had fired off an email to the entire board claiming Mom had threatened the guard with physical harm. Ridiculous. I wanted to scream. The paramedics finally pulled away. Police took down my statement quickly, urging me to get to the hospital as soon as I could. A kind officer offered me a ride since Dad had gone ahead in the ambulance. Once inside the squad car, I found myself blinking back tears. My mind replayed the image of Mom, strapped to a gurney. This was the woman I looked up to more than anyone, the unstoppable force of the legal system, laid low by a neighborhood enforcer with a stun gun. In that moment, though, a fierce resolve began to bloom in my chest. They had no idea the scale of the fight they'd just started. Mom always said that justice, once set in motion, was like a roaring train. And now, that train was barreling straight for Oakleaf Creek's HOA. Mom stayed in the hospital overnight for observation. The taser prongs had caused bruising, and the electrical shock left her with minor muscle spasms, but thankfully no permanent damage. By the next morning, she was propped up against the pillows in a crisp hospital gown, dictating legal notes into her phone. A resolute gleam lit her eyes. She might have been physically shaken, but her spirit was intact, burning with a quiet fury I'd rarely seen. Dad hovered nearby, face etched with worry. Every now and then, he tried to get Mom to relax. But the truth was, from the moment she was conscious, she'd been building her legal case. "I want full assault charges," she kept saying. "And if the HOA facilitated this, I want them named as co-defendants." I pulled up a chair beside her bed. "Shouldn't you focus on, resting?" I asked gently. She gave me a soft smile. "Sweetheart, I appreciate the concern, but resting won't hold these people accountable. I'll heal up one way or another. But this kind of misuse of authority, it needs to be stopped before somebody else gets hurt." Her phone buzzed again. The district attorney's office was calling, and Mom's face lit up with a certain formidable determination. She answered, her voice clipped and controlled. I heard only fragments. "Yes, I'm the victim in this case. Absolutely pressing charges. The police have the taser body cam footage from the officer on scene. Yes, I want to schedule a meeting as soon as possible." After the call, she tapped the phone against the bed sheet. "Well," she said, "this is going to be interesting. It's not every day that the prosecutor's office finds itself representing one of its own. But they're behind me 100%. Over the next several hours, a steady trickle of visitors came by the hospital room. Detective Ferris from the local precinct arrived first to take Mom's full statement. Even in a hospital gown, she was formidable, reciting every detail with methodical precision. She explained how the security guard, McNeil, threatened her, refused to let her pass, and fired the taser after she turned to go back inside. The detective took notes so furiously, I thought his pen might run out of ink. Then came a surprise, a gentle knock at the door, and in walked Mr. Richardson, a stooped older man who lived a few houses down from us. He clutched his hat nervously, looking guilty, as if apologizing for something he hadn't even done. "Jeanette," he said, voice trembling. I can't believe what happened. I heard the whole story from the neighbors. My wife and we want you to know we support you, and we're ready to testify if you need us." Mom blinked in surprise. "Testify?" "Yes, ma'am," he said, fiddling with the brim of his hat. "We saw a bit from across the street. We saw McNeil push you. It was wrong, so wrong. We'll do whatever it takes to help your case." Tears welled up in Mom's eyes. In that moment, I realized that while she was tough, she appreciated the kindness of neighbors who wouldn't just hide behind closed doors. She thanked him, promised to keep them updated, and said his testimony could be crucial. The story hit the local news that evening. Security guard Tasers county prosecutor in HOA dispute. I got texts from classmates who saw it on TV. Social media lit up with outrage. A small group of older Oakleaf Creek residents rallied around Mom, praising her for standing up against an increasingly tyrannical HOA board. Others seemed spooked, worried that the entire community would face negative publicity. One rumor in particular spread like wildfire. Cynthia Marshall, the HOA president, had fled town or was at least unavailable for comment. Some claimed she was hiding at a relative's house in another state. Others said she'd called an emergency board meeting to strategize a legal defense. Meanwhile, from her hospital bed, Mom was already drafting a civil lawsuit, naming the HOA as well as McNeil. "He was operating under the HOA's directive," she said to Dad and me, "and that makes them liable. They can't just farm out violence and claim ignorance. This is going to be a significant case." Dad squeezed her hand. "I just want you safe," he said softly. "This is all so insane. I mean, a taser? Over some landscaping gravel and a $47 fine." Mom's gaze turned distant. "It's not really about the gravel," she murmured. "Some people get a little authority and it goes straight to their head. They can't stand being challenged. Well, they've picked the wrong fight." She explained her plan. First, push for criminal charges against McNeil, assault, possibly battery with a dangerous weapon. Second, a civil suit for damages against both McNeil and the HOA, focusing on negligence and violation of homeowner rights. Finally, she wanted to petition for an investigation into the board's practices to see if there was a pattern of harassment against residents. "I suspect they've done smaller versions of this to others," she said, "just never anything so blatant." Watching her strategize, I felt a fierce pride. Yes, it was terrifying to see her in a hospital bed, but she wasn't curled up in fear. She was preparing to strike back tenfold, using every ounce of her legal expertise. Toward the end of the day, Dad finally managed to get her to put down her phone and rest. The evening nurse turned off the overhead lights, leaving only the gentle glow of a side lamp. I pulled the chair closer to the bed, letting Mom doze while Dad and I stared out the window at the city lights. Quietly, Dad confided in me. "Jake, I've seen your mom go up against some hard people. Gang leaders, white-collar criminals, you name it. But you know what's different about this?" I shook my head. His voice dropped to a near whisper. "This is personal, and personal can be dangerous. It can lead to reckless actions by people who are used to running things their own way. Just be ready for anything." I nodded, swallowing hard. I recalled the stony expression on McNeil's face and the rumors swirling about Cynthia Marshall. The HOA board might be cowed, but cornered adversaries sometimes double down. As I glanced at Mom sleeping, I felt the weight of Dad's words settle on my chest. I knew the fight would be ugly, but I also knew, with unwavering certainty, that if anyone was prepared to face it, it was my mom. A single taser had ignited this storm, and the full brunt of her legal wrath was about to descend on Oakleaf Creek. Mom was discharged the next morning, arms still bandaged where the taser barbs had dug into her skin. The first thing she did after stepping inside our house was to carefully peel away every neon notice the HOA had slapped on the front door. With a determined yank, she tossed them into a folder labeled evidence. Word had spread across the neighborhood. A few brave neighbors came by to deliver casseroles or baked goods, the traditional suburban show of solidarity. One older couple even gave Mom a basket of homemade banana bread, whispering their thanks for standing up to the HOA's bullies. Yet for every show of support, there were as many folks who just peered through their blinds. Oakleaf Creek was an older community, mostly retirees. People feared stirring the pot. They dreaded the idea of retribution from the HOA board. My mother, on the other hand, took retribution as a challenge. She spent the next week gathering statements, meeting with the district attorney, and drafting her own lawsuit. The criminal side moved faster than I'd expected. The DA pressed assault charges against McNeil. The police had ample evidence. The taser was recovered, and multiple witnesses confirmed Mom hadn't threatened him or brandished any weapon. Even the body cam footage from the responding officer showed McNeil's disproportionate aggression. By all accounts, it was an open and shut case. A couple of days later, we got word that Cynthia Marshall finally surfaced. She'd hired a defense attorney, someone known for representing corporate clients. Rumors said the HOA board was scrambling to avoid a lawsuit that could bankrupt them. A surprising number of residents were outraged by the taser incident and openly questioned the board's judgment. Some demanded Cynthia's resignation. Others wanted the board dissolved entirely. One Saturday morning, while Mom was at the courthouse finalizing some paperwork, a group of men I recognized from the HOA's maintenance committee showed up on our lawn. They were armed with clipboards and measuring tapes, apparently doing some inspection. I confronted them before they could get near the porch. "What are you guys doing here?" I demanded. "You have no right to be on our property." One of them, a short man with a mustache that reminded me of a silent film villain, cleared his throat. "We received a directive to reevaluate the gravel installation. We're ensuring it meets drainage guidelines." I felt a flare of anger. "You think you could just keep harassing us?" Before he could respond, a voice behind me cut in, "This harassment stops now." Mom had arrived, stepping out of her car in the driveway. She looked like a storm cloud in her charcoal pantsuit, legal papers clutched under her arm. The men in front of me scattered like ants. They must have recognized her from the news coverage or simply sensed her no-nonsense aura. One by one, they retreated to their HOA-branded van. As they drove off, Mom let out a long breath. "They're still at it," she muttered, trying to intimidate us. "Well, let's see if they feel so bold after Monday." "Monday?" I asked. "I'm filing the civil suit first thing in the morning. And guess who's receiving subpoenas? Cynthia Marshall and every board member who authorized these enforcement measures." A couple of days later, the storm fully broke. We filed the lawsuit at the county courthouse. The claims were numerous: assault, battery, negligent training and supervision, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and violation of homeowner rights. Mom made sure to list each separate claim meticulously, building a fortress of legal arguments. The story took over the local news cycle again, especially when the DA announced formal charges against McNeil. But what made it bigger was a hidden trove of email correspondences that came to light during the discovery phase. Some HOA board members turned on Cynthia, leaking email chains that revealed she'd specifically instructed McNeil to use whatever methods necessary to enforce compliance. She'd singled out my mom's name, referencing a history of disrespect at the city council. Clearly, it was personal. Once those emails went public, everything changed. Support for Cynthia Marshall evaporated overnight. Residents demanded her resignation. Sponsors and vendors that worked with the HOA board distanced themselves, citing ethical concerns. She tried to claim that her words were taken out of context, but the damage was done. In a final blow, McNeil, probably hoping for a plea deal, turned on her as well. Through his lawyer, he alleged that Cynthia had told a mom was dangerous and had a history of violence, urging him to be prepared. It was all nonsense, but it fed into his misguided sense of authority. The criminal trial against McNeil proceeded swiftly. He ended up pleading guilty to a lesser charge of aggravated battery, receiving probation and mandatory community service. As for the civil suit, it culminated in a settlement that forced the HOA's insurance to pay a hefty amount in damages and attorney fees. The board was effectively dismantled, with multiple resignations, including Cynthia's. In the end, though, Mom didn't gloat. As I rode with her back from the settlement hearing, I asked how she felt. Relieved? I offered. Vindicated? She took a deep breath. A little of both. But mostly sad it had to come to this. I mean, this community was our home for years. It's a shame a handful of power-hungry individuals could wreak such havoc. I nodded, thinking back to that first day of tension when she got that email about a $47 fine. How quickly it had spiraled from petty notices to physical assault. But out of that chaos, a lot of folks in Oakleaf Creek found a voice. Neighbors spoke up, demanded accountability, and showed that even in a tight-knit community, justice has its place. As for Cynthia Marshall, the last I heard, she was facing her own legal troubles. Mom believed in the principle that no one is above the law, not even an HOA president who thinks she can bully everyone else. After the scandal, the state looked into her finances and found some questionable discrepancies. She likely wouldn't be meddling in local affairs again anytime soon. By the time we pulled into our driveway, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The gravel mom had installed sparkled in the waning light, a testament to the absurd starting point of it all. She turned off the ignition, then rested her hand on my shoulder. Let this be a lesson, Jake. Stand your ground when you're right, even if the opposition seems massive. Bullies rely on scaring people into silence. And fear is the one thing they can't handle when you refuse to let it control you. I smiled as we got out of the car. The old mailbox stood unwavering, the front porch free of threatening notices. Our house felt like a home again, not a war zone. We walked up the path, side by side, content in the knowledge that the tyranny lurking behind every petty HOA regulation could be toppled, especially when it runs into the unstoppable force of my mom, the fearless prosecutor who refused to be silenced by a $47 fine or a taser's crackle. The end.